UCD Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice is delighted to present the first episode of a new series, Conversations with the Experts, in which members of the Institute explore key issues in the field of criminology and criminal justice in conversation with policymakers and practitioners. Today we'll be discussing restorative justice with two leading experts in the field. Dr. Marie Keenan, Associate Professor in the UCD School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice, and a long-standing member of the Institute, has written extensively on the subject of restorative justice after sexual violence, and is also an accredited psychotherapist, restorative justice practitioner, and a registered social worker. Ursula Fernée is Assistant Principal Probation Officer in the Irish Probation Service and leads the Probation Service's Restorative Justice and Victim Services Unit, which was recently set up to support the provision of restorative justice interventions across the Probation Service. We chose restorative justice as our first subject in this series, not only because it is a seminal topic in the field, but also to mark Restorative Justice Week, which runs this year from the 15th to the 22nd of November. The launch of the Conversation series is also a key element of the programme of events to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the UCD Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. So welcome to you both. And to begin, I wanted to ask you maybe a general question about your experiences of restorative justice in the criminal justice sector and really why it's important to you. So Marie, we might start with you. Could you tell us about your experiences with regards to research and your role as an independent practitioner in the field?
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. Well, I trained as a social worker many years ago, but then I went on to train as a systemic and forensic psychotherapist in the 1980s. And so I've always been, before I came to work in the university, in the academy, I was practicing in the area of psychotherapy, mainly in the areas of domestic and sexual crime. And so in a way, before I actually had the words restorative justice for what I was doing, I was one of those practitioners that always worked with victims and always worked with offenders, with both cohorts and their families and organizations all simultaneously. So I was doing restorative justice really before A, I was trained to do it, and B, before I called it that, bringing victims and offenders together in dialogue about issues that had affected their lives. So then I trained as a restorative justice practitioner at the University of Ulster and with Mark Umbright, US practitioner who came to Ireland, and with Janine Jeske, who was in Dublin and did workshops, and then I went to work with her for a short period in the United States in a maximum security prison. And so then when I went to work in UCD, I was interested in continuing this practice, but also it became apparent that there was a need for more research. And it was just fortuitous that I was doing an Irish study with Facing Forward as collaborators on the needs of victims and offenders in relation, and would they be interested in restorative justice, were we to develop a program in the country for them. And as part of that, we interviewed 149 stakeholders, judges, barristers, media, probation officers, NGOs, therapists, everybody, 30 victims and 23 offenders, 10 in custody and 13 in the country. But I also had a call then to know would I be interested in being a co-PI in a Daphne funded research project to look at integrated responses to sexual crime and the role of restorative justice. So with Estelle Zinsteg and myself, we led that team. And so those both studies were reported on. And then, of course, I went on to be the external examiner for the University of Ulster for all their restorative justice training and so on. And I have now facilitated quite a number of cases, victim-offender dialogues. I've supported some people through that, and I've facilitated circles. So my interest in this is really as an additional justice mechanisms for victims and offenders.
Brilliant. It's a fascinating career, I have to say. Thank you so much. Ursula, could you talk about the use of restorative justice within the probation service and also your personal experiences with it during your career?
Okay, thank you very much, Deirdre, for that nice welcome, and nice to be here with you and with Marie this afternoon, and indeed to hear of your interesting journey, Marie, in terms of your own career development. Also delighted to be here marking Restorative Justice Week, because it has now become a very important week in the probation calendar, I'm glad to say. I work currently, as you said, Deirdre, in the Restorative Justice and Victim Services Unit, but I've had a fairly long number of years in probation practice, working on the ground as a practitioner and working as a manager on various projects, both connected with custodial settings and in the community as well. And I suppose I would think my first exposure to and my interest in restorative justice came in relation to the application of desistance theory in working with offenders, and looking at the symmetry between some of the theoretical perspectives of desistance and those with restorative justice, as in the use of narrative, dialogue, relational theory, all of those pieces that are such a critical part of our work with offenders. And I suppose just to say that you know, for our viewers, that the role of and the aim of probation work is to reduce the likelihood of further offending, and clearly to reduce the likelihood of further harm to individuals, families and communities. And in that context, probation officers like me, that's my background. My background is in social work. They are trained social workers, and we are trained social workers working in a criminal justice setting. And if I'm to say a little, Deirdre, about the story of restorative justice then in probation, and I think it's a story of a number of chapters, and I'll try and go through the chapters fairly quickly so that nobody falls asleep. But maybe to start, our opening chapter really would go back to the late 90s. And again, to talk about wider probation practice, we were moving much more closely to evidence-informed practice and understanding better what works with offenders. So very much focus on offender rehabilitation and looking at, you know, what was going to possibly produce the best outcomes and what were the approaches. But at that time, we also were looking at that symmetry between restorative justice and the work that we were doing with offenders. And the first step on that journey, if I could say, was the establishment of 2 community-based organizations, funding for those organizations that were set up at the end of the 90s. And those projects were operating, I think it's probably correct to say, in parallel to probation practice, taking referrals directly from the courts, but they were working with some of those practices that I've talked about earlier in terms of narrative and dialogue and problem solving. And many of our current projects that we work with, like Throw and Lekela and the Corn Market Project in Wexford, also now deliver restorative justice interventions. So back to my next chapter, I suppose I'd moved from that to the Children Act, the 2001, but implementation didn't come until 2004, 2005. And I guess the spirit of the Children Act was highly restorative, although it wasn't specified as such. And the setting up of young persons probation embraced restorative justice practice and introduced models of restorative justice. So now we have moved restorative justice within the organization, but working mainly with young offenders and less serious offenders. And we have then the report from the National Commission came in 2010, which really emphasized the need to consider to develop restorative justice interventions. A number of changes then over 2013, 2014 in terms of our own organization developing a strategy, and jumping quickly to the end of 2018, the setting up of the unit that I now work in with 2 colleagues, which was really about supporting the wider use of restorative justice right across our work with offenders, adult and young people. And just to say before I finish, Deirdre, the pathways, it has been, I think, for a number of years, there was maybe confusion. How does one access restorative justice? where does it happen and how does it happen? So one of the things that we have tried to do, and I'm sure could always do better, is to articulate, the pathways to restorative justice and the importance of the options being available for referrals from the courts, directly from the judiciary, as part of assessments, as part of pre-sanction reports. Restorative justice being used in our work with offenders as part of supervision, in a custodial setting for somebody who is accessing counselling and support and through care, and maybe as part of reintegration back into the community. And then directly, and I think this is the piece that's really important, the direct contact from victims who might inquire, maybe not even calling it restorative justice because they don't have the name, and that's another discussion and another debate, but when they contact us, that it's very clear that they are giving some consideration to this. And we believe in the Probation Service that really, if we are to do restorative justice effectively and in a timely way, we need, in our work with offenders, to be focusing very much on victim awareness work and the development of empathy. Restorative justice, it's not a starting point. It's further along that continuum of intervention in relation to the victim perspective. I just wanted to say, Deirdre, that in terms of we're building our capacity, and in terms of, I suppose, numbers, just observing the buy-in, if I could use that word, from the judiciary. And I'm referencing regional figures and local data now, that the judiciary in 2019, there were approximately just up to 100 referrals where a pre-sanction report together with an assessment for restorative justice was actually requested. And looking at, because of the way we work, we tend to engage with different regions around the country. So a little snapshot in October of this year, despite all the challenges with COVID, in the Northwest region, which would include 3 to 4 counties, there was work underway at different stages of restorative justice, just preparation and interventions with 25 cases. Our central data case tracking system is somewhat out of date and needs to pick up more of the data that we need to have, linking back with Marie's point about research and the importance of research and evidence-informed practice, which I'm delighted is very much on the agenda of our parent department in the Department of Justice, as part of the transformation programme. But, we look forward to being able to, the data is there, but being able to mine data more centrally around success, what success looks like, victim engagement, and that's a work in progress, I have to say, at this point in time.
Great. Well, it'll be very interesting to see the results coming out of that research. And it's also interesting how embedded restorative justice practice is becoming in probation practice these days. So Ursula, I'll stay with you maybe for the next question. So restorative justice is often described as an umbrella term because it encompasses quite an array of practices and in theory can take place at any stage in the justice system. So I wanted to ask you whether you see any distinction, first of all, between the terms restorative justice and restorative practice.
Yes, I guess you'd ask that question, and I'm not sure Marie, what your thoughts are on it, but for me, and I've actually moved some way in my thinking around this. I think it's something of an artificial distinction. In a way, restorative practice is how we do restorative justice, and the same features, the same factors that are highlighted as important in restorative justice are equally true for restorative practice. So the importance of dialogue, of fair process, respect, collaboration, all of those are central to both. And I think it's probably much more useful to think of it on a continuum, really, of intervention, with maybe, if you're starting at this end, looking at the more informal practices, which is really about helping people to get in touch with emotions, conversation, maybe moving to the use of restorative justice questions, and then further along, and the use of circles, which would be seen, I think, as somewhat more informal, although I'm open to correction on that, and then more to the more formal models of conferencing. I think it's an important question, though, for us in terms of the framework that guides us as we go forward. And I think the restorative practice model is been embraced in the school communities and local communities, and Restorative Practices Ireland, their website is well worth visiting in terms of some of the work that has been done there. I think it's the other reason I think, Deirdre, it's really important is because for restorative justice to take hold and to become more normative, I think we need to have a more restorative response in our society, and that institutions that in society and society itself will have a better understanding if we can see. So it's very important that there is that harmony between both those approaches, whether you see yourself as doing restorative practice or restorative justice.
Brilliant, thank you. And Marie, your thoughts on that question?
Yes. Well, I'm of the view that there is quite a sameness, but there's also a difference. And that I am really of the view now, and the more I go on, clearer that we need to keep the term restorative justice for anything of a restorative nature to do with crime and criminality. And whilst Ursula is of course correct that we do practices that are restorative are part of what we do in restorative justice, I think that it is better to keep the distinction and to keep them clear. So restorative justice, from my perspective, is anything to do with crime, and restorative practices is anything to do outside of that to do with conflict. So to do with the classroom, to do with the neighborhood disputes, and so on. And the reason, and I'm kind of interested that Ivo Ersten in Belgium has been also talking about this at the Global Conference on Restorative Justice. And I'm completely persuaded by Ivo's perspective on this, because I feel it too. I think if we call everything restorative practices, then it's everything and it's nothing. And actually, restorative justice in the area of crime, whether it's youth offenders or adult offenders, in minor crime, or then in the more serious crime, it's quite a different operation and quite a different level of skill is required in facilitating those kinds of cases, serious crime and so on, because of the impact on the victim, because of the trauma, because of the dynamics of the particular type of crime, because of the importance of the law and due process, and because of all the rest. Whereas restorative practices can be taught very easily within a few days and facilitated in, lower level conflict, no less important, of course, in a schoolyard or in a neighborhood. So I'm very much of the view that we need to keep restorative justice as the absolute title of what we are trying to do when it comes to crime. And then I think there's another small distinction that can be made. Estelle Zinstag and myself have been making it in our book, and we're slightly revising it now. But we talk about fully restorative justice practice or partial. And so Ursula mentioned like victim awareness work with offenders, or as I used to do myself in the Granada Institute, different kinds of modules, for helping offenders or whoever become more aware. But again, that's partial restorative. Restorative justice really involves whether actual or simulated or some other variant of victims and offenders coming together either in dialogue, either together through victim offender mediation or shuttle mediation or in circles or in conferences. So I think we need to be really clear about the terms and about the concepts and the theoretical underpinnings of this work.
Brilliant, thank you. And a follow-on question, and I'll stay with you, Marie, for this one. And you've answered it to an extent already, but what, in your opinion, are the core principles, values, and practices associated with what we call it restorative justice or restorative practices?
I think we'll say justice, Deirdre. It's important. Marie is absolutely right.
Well, thank you. If we're talking about crime, it's probably easier. Well, from my perspective, I'm not. to talk about restorative justice. Because it's quite serious what we're talking about, and it's quite serious what we're proposing to facilitate. It's not kind of light work. No restorative practice work is light, but so like I make a distinction between values and principles and so on, of course. And so like truth, as much as possible, we're looking for truth telling as a value. We're looking for justice. We can talk all day about what it is, what justice means. We're looking for responsibility taking, where persons who've done the harm are at least willing to acknowledge as part of the process, as part of the requisite facility for engaging, that they acknowledge wrongdoing. So responsibility taking, dignity and respect. And so in terms of serious crime, and Ursula and I, we can talk about these kinds of little things in another way, but a core principle in serious crime is that the process is victim initiated rather than offender initiated. There are times when it's right that the restorative justice is offender initiated, as in youth offending, when the legislation provides for this and so on, as in Northern Ireland in the youth diversion schemes and so on. But in serious crime, where there is interpersonal harm, one of the principles from my perspective is that it must be victim initiated. It's a voluntary process for both parties. Neither can be coerced in any shape or form into it. It's participative, it's flexible, i.e. context and case specific. Safety, procedural safety and actual physical safety are all of paramount importance. Preparation, 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 and in serious crime, only facilitated by highly trained facilitators who understand the impact of trauma, the dynamics of the particular type of crime, the law and due process, and then the transferability of skills. So if a model in Belgium might not easily transfer well here, so there has to be the particularities of the culture and context, and then of course the methodologies. So that's what I would say about the principles and values.
Brilliant. So the meanings might shift across time and space, or across different parts of the criminal justice system, or even across different crime types. That's really interesting. Ursula, what are your thoughts on that question, on the values, principles and philosophies?
Yeah, I think Marie has covered a lot and particularly on the values around, I suppose for me too, the piece I would put in that person-centered engagement with people is the importance of facilitating the person's voice. And in particular, we have to talk about the voice of the victim, because in many ways, restorative justice is a response to the victim not having a voice in the traditional criminal justice setting. So it's about facilitating that voice, hearing what's been said and listening with the appropriate level of skill, which goes back to Marie's point about the need for trained facilitators. I suppose in terms of the principles that underpin, maybe to say a bit more on that, and I was thinking as you were speaking, Marie, again, that it is, we draw from maybe many of the values in social work and other disciplines, but it's about how they are brought together within the framework that is a restorative justice intervention, which I think is critically important. And in relation to the actual principles, I think for me, located right within probation and the criminal justice system, it is around that issue of that victim awareness work and the offender taking responsibility and owning the harm that they've done. Secondly, that, our key principle for us is that any response to crime should attempt to repair in as much as is possible. I always think of that phrase from, I think it's Howard Zerr, about repairing to the greatest extent possible. And I always have that in kind of strong, bold writing. That is really important. So the harm that is suffered by the victim. And again, you know, as what we believe, and we may talk a bit more about particular types of offending, but for us, restorative justice can be considered if all the other features are in place and we are very aware of the safety and the skill level that's required to intervene with victims, but that restorative justice could be considered for a wide range of crimes. I think its complementarity and being aware, and this is back to the earlier discussion about restorative practice and restorative justice, that restorative justice located in the criminal justice system. So the importance of, you know, where it fits in terms of equity and fair practice and transparent practice is very important. And I suppose the final point again was just to reiterate what Marie has said around the importance of it being delivered by skilled professionals who use a collaborative approach and who, the best way I think of describing it is who manage the choreography and the pace. And I do want to emphasize pace and timing, because that is really important in the victim's journey in particular. When I said earlier about inquiries where people are thinking through what might be possible, and we're helping them to find the language if they don't already know it, but they may need time to consider that. So I think this maybe, I think there's also a point of not, you know, too long or too short, but I think there is something, and that's very critical in social work practice, about moving at the pace of the two people involved. And there may be some conflicts between the two parties, but the skill of the facilitator is to work to balance the interests of both and the needs of both. And that can be a challenge.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's really interesting. Did you want to come back in on that, Marie? Sorry.
A little bit on that. Because, you know, in some of our research, this is Estelle Zinzag, in Zinzag, what we found, now our research was on restorative justice after sexual violence, but we had reviewed a lot of the literature and we'd done site visits in multiple countries and talked to practitioners across the globe and all the rest. And the message is really clear. And there are two schools of thought in the literature and in practice. One is that actually the call for this practice taking place is actually the victims, and then the willingness of the offender to participate, not the professionals. That's one school of thought. And the other is that the school, you know, the professionals must have the say and they risk assess everybody, and only if the professionals are happy, whatever. This is a big debate in the literature, and it's a debate across the globe in relation to this. And I certainly am of the former, and which is that the practitioners and the professionals are not centered in this. We have an obligation to make this available when victims want it and offenders are willing. And our job is not to stop it happening, to make it happen, but our job is to make it happen in as safe a way as possible. But that's not, and I know this isn't what Ursula is saying, but I just want to make the point, that is not by telling victims that we know better than they do what's good for them, or by telling victims that we think the offender is not really good enough to do it. We need to give all the information to all the parties, the facilitators, and then we make the process as safe as possible. And in our research, we found that there are multiple ways that practitioners across the globe have found to make the practice safe. And we haven't got time maybe to go into that, but I just want to make that point. And then the second point, I think, just to pick up on something that Ursula said about, we might go on to discuss this, where restorative justice after crime should be located. Ursula was saying in the justice system. And I would say, of course, when it's involving crime, it must be within the umbrella of justice. But, or maybe cross-governmental department, which would be my preference. And the reason is that we must not forget that only a small part of crime ever gets into the justice system. In sexual crime, for instance, we could say maybe about 10% gets into the justice system because of the high attrition rates. So where are those victims to go for services? For restorative justice services. So whilst it's important that restorative justice services would be located in relation to crime under a justice umbrella or a cross-governmental departmental umbrella, we must also remember that a lot of crime where victims might want restorative justice, maybe cases didn't get beyond the DPP or whatever, or were not reported. Those victims all need restorative justice. So if we only confine ourselves to cases that have come through the justice system, let's say that are on probation orders or in prison, we're going to miss a huge number of victims who are looking for services of this nature, restorative justice.
Brilliant. I don't know if you wanted to come back in on that, Ursula.
A little bit, but we don't want to get stuck on any one point. I'm sure you have plenty more questions for us, Deirdre, but I think the point that Marie made earlier, there's a richness in what you were saying, Marie, but the point you made earlier about somebody determining this isn't the right time for you, I suppose what that said to me very strongly is that we need not to recreate some of the deficits that we have identified in the criminal justice system. So that would be quite criminal to do that again. So that is a really important message, I think, that we both, I think you'll agree, Marie, want to convey. And in terms of the issue of responding to victims' needs, victims are victim-centric. And I think I made the point earlier about the victim awareness work and the centrality of victim work for probation, because in order to, I think the word that Marie used was about offenders being willing. You cannot begin to talk to offenders, especially when we're working with them. And I'm talking now very much from our experience on the probation side, obviously, and there's a wider question that Marie has mentioned there about outside of the system. But when we are working with offenders, to have the best possible opportunity of being successful in responding to a victim need. And we also believe that, there is a rehabilitative purpose for offenders, but our focus, we've learned as we've moved through the years and through the experiences and in response to victim requests, that we need to provide, and I think each justice sector has taken steps, and we might come back to that later, around being very clear about what their service is, what they do in response to victims. But we need to be able to deliver on that and deliver on that in a meaningful way. And that's why I was making the point earlier that restorative justice, that for offenders to be willing, the work that is done with them around the harm that they've caused is very critical and could be an indicator of a positive restorative, that a very positive restorative justice intervention could take place.
But in my practice and in the literature and mainly in the research that Estelle and myself did, offenders who've never had any therapy whatsoever are still sometimes willing to participate in restorative justice. And if the victim wants it, and the process is made as safe as possible within that, there is, by skilled facilitators, there is really no reason why this should be prohibited. However, if, like in New Zealand, if offenders haven't done therapy, or they haven't been prosecuted, or there haven't been proceedings, and they can still participate in restorative justice by means of an agreement as part of the restorative process, therapy for the offender can be mandated, if you like, and various other social pacts, so to speak, if they were, let's say, interfamilial, or if they were to meet in a common area, or so students, let's say, in a university or whatever, that there are agreements, and that they can often be checked out, so to speak. The compliance, let's say, with the agreement is often checked out by the designated restorative justice agency, or the probation service, or the police sometimes. So there are ways, even if offenders haven't done a minute's therapy, we still should not think that that's not possible to do a very useful restorative intervention, as we know from research in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think the findings of your research with Estelle and other research, Marie, in that regard are really interesting. And I think the question we seem to have moved on to is, you know, restorative justice outside of the criminal justice process. Because obviously I'm coming very much from within the criminal justice system. I think the important word that you used there was around agreement and contract and how that gets managed and oversight. And I guess, you know, part of our focus has been ensuring that the practices that we deliver are done in as safe, as professional way as absolutely possible with skilled, trained people. So I think, you know, progress has been made in that regard. I would say, with absolute respect to the research that has been done, that there's a lot more analysis that would need to be done. And I think we haven't mentioned legislation at all yet, but when I was doing my quick, you know, run through, I spoke the victims of crime legislation. That's the first piece of legislation that actually references restorative justice explicitly. And I think that was a very positive development. But I think, and, you know, we might talk about that as we think into the future, Deirdre, but I think there is further work that needs to be done around how restorative justice legislation and more pure legislation can be framed. And some of the issues that Marie is raising there, I think, need to be addressed in that context.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's a really interesting question to kind of ask, you know, whether restorative justice can occur or should occur outside the justice system. And Marie has obviously lots of experience in facilitating this. I was just wondering, maybe I'll stay with you for the moment on this question, Ursula. How would you see that being operationalized if it was to be done within, you know, the or under the umbrella of the criminal justice system or an interagency grouping, as Marie suggested earlier? Could you see it being achievable?
Ooh, I think that's quite a big question for me to answer from the position that I occupy at the moment. But certainly, I think in relation to what you said there about multi-agency, I think the multi-agency piece is critical anyway in relation to the delivery of restorative justice. And I think if we were had a more defined framework around how that could operate in the context of cases that are coming into the criminal justice system, even if only, I shouldn't say only, but even cases that come to the attention of the guards and then maybe get diverted out. I think there would be real scope then to take another step, to look at cases where, and I think we mentioned earlier, maybe in family situations, and some of this work is happening already, where it's built on a level of trust between the parties involved. I wouldn't feel able to comment further beyond that. I think we certainly need to be looking at it, and I think we'll be better able to look at it when our framework for how restorative justice gets delivered more broadly in criminal justice. I mean, picking up on Marie's point, with cases that aren't necessarily part of the probation service, you know, are being worked with by my colleagues and myself.
Brilliant. And Marie, do you have any thoughts about how that kind of system might be operationalized?
Yeah, well, because there are different models across the globe for how this can happen. So some countries operate the restorative justice under, let's say Belgium, under the justice umbrella, a different service, but under the justice umbrella, and a very fine service. But one of the limitations is that people who do not report the crime or so on often can't avail of the service because the funding and the legislation has it very much locked in under criminal justice. And then you have other countries, let's say New Zealand and others, where there is legislative provision, but where there's also a raft of guidance for policy guidance for how to do this, deliver these services outside of reporting and criminal justice, if you like, in different funded agencies. And then you have Finland, who have a different model and various things. But just to say, Ursula was talking about legislation, and that's important, but it's not the most important thing when it comes to restorative justice. And so again, a study that Estelle and myself haven't yet published, but we surveyed 74 restorative justice programs across the globe, diverse, you know, from Asia to Dublin, if you like. And something like 45% of those programs have been doing restorative justice after sexual violence for 10 years or more. And 60% have been doing them for 5 years or more. So we're really behind the curve in Ireland, thinking that we have to be very cautious about how we go with this. It's happening across the globe under the radar. Often a lot of it isn't written up in the literature, and Ursula is completely right that we need more research and so on. But when you talk to practitioners across the globe, as we did in our global study, it's all there. They're just busy doing the work and they're not writing it up, and the researchers hadn't arrived yet to actually capture the research and the outcomes. So I think, and certainly I know from talking to some police officers and so on, there, for instance, historical child abuse, for instance, clergy abuse, historical clergy abuse, where there will never be, in some cases, prosecutions because the evidential threshold is so high and blah, blah, blah. They're ready for DPP intervention to offer restorative justice. There are lots and lots and lots of cohorts that we don't require legislation at all. We just need political will, and I absolutely agree, cross-governmental or interagency, but not just. Sometimes the Department of Justice, and I'm not critical of the Department of Justice at all, it's fantastic and doing amazing work. And Ursula's service, I was a probation officer myself, doing amazing work on this. And also the new research unit and everything in the Department of Justice doing fantastic work. But sometimes when the Department of Justice, I have to make this point, talk about interagency, they talk about the different cohorts within the Department of Justice. So the courts, the probation, you know, there are agencies outside of the Department of Justice that have a view on this, including the academic and academic practitioners such as myself, who might have something to offer.
Brilliant. So there's opportunities there to bring it in, and models there we could use.
Yeah.
Ursula, did you want to come back on that?
No, I think just very briefly to say, I would certainly agree about the multi-agency, interagency approach. What do we mean by that? And I suppose, coming from where I come from with probation, engagement with communities and community-based organisations is second nature, because frankly we couldn't do half of the work we do without the, you know, the expertise and the support and the input that we get from our community-based organisations, both the restorative justice ones and others. But I think I would totally agree with what Marie is saying there, but I come back to that piece about the framework. And I also, by the way, totally agree that certainly I can remember going back to conferences 10 and 15 years ago, people banging the drum saying, we need the legislation, we need the legislation. And I often think that sometimes we can focus over much on legislation. I feel now that we are ready, we're much better prepared, the knowledge base, the practice. As Marie says, lots of things that have been happening under the radar when she was talking about the international context. I think that's probably true here as well with certain cases. And in different contexts, we have discovered that restorative justice is being delivered and there isn't a shared knowledge or understanding of what different services are doing. So yes, I would totally agree that we need to be much more aware of the services that are on offer out there and what's been done, and the capacity for them to be much more integrated and to work together to achieve, you know, better outcomes and a higher quality and a more equitable access to services within the criminal justice system, and not at all opposed or closing my mind to the options that Marie has laid out there in terms of people who don't come to the criminal justice system.
And you know, when I'm talking about multi-agency or cross-agency, I know, of course, Ursula, the work you do in multi-agency collaboration with communities and so on. I'm talking about at a program design level, you know, like it was wonderful to see the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, in the Supporting a Victim's Journey recently saying that after the mapping exercise that's being done by the Restorative Justice Strategies for Change group, that once that study is completed, the department is going to establish a multi-agency group to scope out the requirements, I'm reading it here, for a more integrated, consistent, visible and high quality restorative justice service for vulnerable victims who wish to pursue this pathway. That is just an incredible statement and a wonderful statement, of course, based on the O'Malley report, of which Ursula was a member in putting forward that report. So I think this is really good, and I just would make a plea to the Department of Justice to consider, you know, this multi-agency committee broadly, and also to consider the academics who have a lot of expertise in this, and practitioners.
Brilliant. And I think, I suppose it's a related question, and it's also quite a large question, so it may be a difficult one to answer. But I was wondering, you know, what are your thoughts about the institutionalization of restorative justice within the criminal justice system? Do you think the goals of restorative justice are better achieved when when such practices are presented within the criminal justice system as an adjunct to it, or completely separate to it? So I might ask you, Marie, first of all, what your thoughts are on that.
Look, very quickly, before I answer that question, I'll give a couple of quick examples of why I take the position that we need to think broadly about this. So I was consulted a couple of years ago, by a young girl who had been abused when she was in a dance school 15 years ago, and the offender had served 2 years in prison. And she had spent the next 15 years of her life, she was 15 at the time, trying to forget, and went as far away in the world as she could to get away from this memory of what had happened. The offender had served a 2-year prison sentence. Now she had developed a number of problems in her life that she felt related to the offence, and she came back to Ireland and wanted to now, having spent 15 years trying to get away from him, she now wanted a restorative meeting with him. And she came to me, hard about to work through various things. We didn't know where the offender was. He was on no order to probation service. He had served prison, 15 years ago. Where were we to start? When I was happy with her that she needed this, she wanted it, and I was happy to facilitate, we had no designated agency to go to start to help this victim find where was the offender so that I could begin to engage with him or write a letter. I had to call in favors, which I won't go into. Another in recent, where there's been historical, again, intrafamilial situation where where the case was not reported, the father is now dead, but the mother was implicated in the thing. They need a service. This family needed a service, which I ended up working with myself. I've had a couple of those. But where were they to go for a service? Where were they to go for this pool of skill and so they ended up coming to me, and I facilitated these, to the best. Obviously we facilitated them well, and I've researched them and we've evaluated them, and I'm about to write them up and so on and so forth. But we need a service, because victims of crime, we need a service outside as well as inside the criminal justice area, maybe under broadly a reconceptualized view of justice that isn't only located to whether the crime was prosecuted and adjudicated. And that's my point. If we're thinking about institutionalized, I think the Department of Justice broad is a logical home place for this, with inputs from health and inputs from maybe child department, children, and various others, communications, because of the online abuse that we're hearing more and more and more about. So we need these inputs, because these victims, many of whom don't fit as the profile of ending their offender in prison or their offender having been prosecuted, those victims still need this service. And I would argue, based on my research, that there is something in this for the offenders also, whether they were prosecuted or not. And I believe that offenders would participate in this, and that their families would support them, because I know from my work with, having worked with offenders, in the Probation Service and in the Granada Institute, that these offenders have to sleep at night themselves, and a program that will help them do something, as the offenders in my study, in the Irish study, said, to do something honourable, having done something so dishonourable, to tell the truth for the first time. They tell us this in research. So this is not how to get at offenders. This is about offender accountability. It's about justice for victims, but it's also about reintegration and integration for all parties and healing. So I think we need to think broadly here. We can't think narrow in the institutionalization of restorative justice. Really
interesting. Ursula, what are your thoughts on that question?
Just a couple of points in response to, I suppose, always when I talk about think about institutionalization or institutions, I say, well, we all have different views about institutionalization, and there's good institutionalization and there's less good institutionalization. So I think I just wanted to say that from the outset. I was interested in Marie's account of people approaching her, and we've had that experience as well in probation, where the person isn't currently subject to our supervision, may have been through the prison system, and we have actually been able to make contact with one or two people in those kind of situations with a view to pursuing some form of dialogue. Now, I think we also need to remember, and we may have said it earlier, Marie, I'm not sure whether you or I said it, but I think, you know, there's a creativity that again must fall within the framework of good restorative justice practice and safe practice, but there can be opportunities for shuttle mediation or shuttle dialogue between people. And in fact, in one of the cases that I was involved in, that's precisely what actually happened. So I don't at all disagree with Marie that there won't be some offenders who will be very willing to engage with this process. And I think it's equally appropriate for in connecting with them, and it's important, and that's why I talked earlier about restorative justice being more widely understood, because if you're hearing it for the first time as an offender, your response may be, well, I went to court, I served my 2 years, I did my time, I paid for the crime. And you know, so there is the other piece that we talked about honour. But if that person hasn't actually had the opportunity to give any consideration to the harm and the victim perspective, it could, and I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it, I'm simply saying that it's a journey for that offender as well. And it's a very important piece that needs to be done. In relation to the where it lies, I've heard Marie speak before about, you know, which government department. I think I'm of the view, apart from residing in criminal justice, in the Department of Justice, that justice is a good fit. But I also feel, as somebody who increasingly, and in many of the workshops that we've done in the context of the Restorative Justice Strategies for Change project that I'm involved in, we have had cross-departmental input, and that has been extremely valuable, with input from the Department of Health and to a lesser extent from the Department of Education. So I do think there, and we all talk about multi-agency and we all talk about interdepartmental, but I still go very much back to, and maybe I'm overly structured coming from a probation background, but I think we do actually need to get our frame as right as possible. But rather than going in with the more traditional, with the justice and the criminal justice institution, we need to think more broadly. So I would say that future practice and with restorative justice, the connectivity, I find it difficult to envisage it without that connectivity, and I think Marie is probably saying the same thing, with the Department of Justice, but it is a bigger piece. And I you know, would say that the Marie referenced the O'Malley report, and you know, I'd want to reference the Programme for Government, because we're talking a lot, we're not talking directly a lot about sexual violence, but because of Marie's experience and the fantastic research that has been done in that area. But I would want to say that some of our work that we have done, not with a huge number of cases, has been in in other forms of serious crime, like the loss of life. two cases, you know, where we were engaging with the families of victims who had lost their lives. So I think we do need to think, you know, more broadly in terms of the shape. And when the programme for government was published this year, again, I think that is certainly a first. And I think it has allowed further discussion in relation to other strategic approaches. I want to try and go beyond strategy to action, and very defined actions. And we're sort of on the threshold of some of that, I think. So, you know, I appreciate you saying, Marie, about the minister's comments, and I think the input in the programme for government is talking about community safety and building capacity with restorative justice. And that goes back to my earlier point, that is an important piece, I think, in actually having restorative justice there as a core piece of our criminal justice practice. And I really do believe now, and that's what I meant when I said about shifting my perspective slightly. I wasn't really willing to look at that maybe as much before, that all of that work with communities and with schools and all of those pieces will contribute to having a much clearer, informed and collaborative approach, and a broader definition of how restorative justice can be delivered, and delivered in a way that is responding to what Marie is finding in her research. But I think we're still not reaching an awful lot of people. I think the worst thing for me is, you know, somebody saying to me, which has happened once or twice, this restorative justice thing, I didn't know about it. This happened to me, and I would have liked the opportunity. With less serious crime, actually, one or two cases. But I really think it will enhance the fabric of our communities if we can provide a broader and a more extensive response to people like that.
Yeah, and can I come in on that, Deirdre, and say, look, on the latter point about people don't know about it, how are they going to know about it if we don't let them know about it? You know what I mean? So certainly in the 2014 report that we wrote, we recommended to government at the time, it was 2014, that there would be a media campaign letting people know about restorative justice, that this is possible. And certainly in your own service, Ursula, now that you have your unit up and running, there ought to be a lot more publicity around to know that when you're ready, when the capacity is there and all the rest. I would say that's really important. And certainly if we get this you know, larger, more elaborated service, there will need to be much more information giving out. I completely agree with Ursula. I think the logical home, if we're talking about crime, the logical home for this, for a broad, elaborated restorative justice service, is in the Department of Justice. I mean, it's logical. They're the department that deal with crime. But because of the impact of the crime on the health and well-being, and because it involves so many children and so on, many of which don't come to the criminal justice system, those areas of expertise and inputs need to be part of this design, let's say. And then the last piece that Ursula was talking, you were talking a little bit about the importance of the victim empathy work and, you know, all that. Many victims have said to me, how can they being me as well, like therapists and probation officers doing victim empathy work, how could they do victim empathy work without him talking to me? I'm the victim. I can do all the victim empathy work he wants. I can tell him what has happened to me. And so I think there's a logic in that sometimes, exactly agree with you, Ursula, that about, you know, that we can't replicate the weaknesses. There are many strengths in the criminal justice system, but we can't replicate the weakness of, you know, taking voice from victims and offenders and whoever, you know, in the interest of, you know, due process and all the other things that are very important. And replicate those weaknesses in restorative justice. And I kind of, when victims say that to me, I can do the victim empathy work. How is he going to know the impact of the crime if he doesn't listen to what I have to tell him? There's a logic in that.
No, and I think that, well, I think my point was really around a continuum of intervention that would lead to restorative justice. I suppose the other point that I wanted to make there when you were speaking, Marie, was around, you know, we have a challenge in our society as well with certain kinds of offending, with sexual violence, around reporting and getting people to come forward. and actually having the opportunity to have their day in court. So we just need to remember that, because again, that's one of the pieces that might, that there is an opportunity for victims to choose the path they want. And that's why you're absolutely right, Marie. What I'm saying really is that we have to do more about the awareness piece, so that people know whether they're victims of sexual violence or any other form of crime, what options are available to them and how they fit with the traditional sanctioning process. Because it doesn't have to be either or, it can be, as we're thinking forward. But I actually think that some of that, how we actually explain that fit is still not as coherent maybe as one would like it to be.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, go on.
I have an article in this month's OLAS magazine, in which I'm actually talking about exactly this point, that wouldn't it be wonderful if every victim had their day in court, if they could? If justice is about proceedings, if we took that to the logical endpoint, then every reported case should end up in proceedings, and and so on. But that doesn't happen, of course, for lots of reasons, mainly the evidential threshold beyond reasonable doubt, understandably, is a high threshold because it gives the state so much power to imprison people and so on. So there are lots of reasons why lots of victims either who report don't get their day in court, and why when they do, there's poor outcome, and why other victims don't report and so on. But after the Murphy and Ryan and all those reports, I was part of the group that took to the media and said, report. In the Savvy study, we found such few reports, so the proportion was so low. We said to victims, report, 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 and we will get you justice. And unfortunately, the attrition rate went higher. There were fewer cases. Now I see, there are still cases being prosecuted, and the DPP has their new unit specific for sexual violence and whatever. But, we need to grasp the justice nettle, in my view, and realize in some cases, not in murder, because most murders are prosecuted and successfully and so on, but in many other cases involving interpersonal violence, the attrition rate is really high. And no matter what the victim does, or if 10 victims put in their statements, I've been involved with a case where there were 6 statements from 6 different victims, and that case still didn't get to trial, that didn't get to proceedings. So what are those victims to do in terms of justice? And that's why we need to think about, absolutely, I agree with you, Ursula, encourage people to report. But when they report and there are no proceedings for very good reasons, often in the DPP's office, or when there are poor outcomes or whatever it is, we need to have additional justice ways of responding. It's just immoral, and we can no longer deny that fact by just continuing with the mantra and keeping ourselves, none of us are doing a mantra, but broad, and nobody is, but the broad systemic mantra of, go to the criminal justice system and you'll get justice. What I have found in my studies and in my practice, that the Gardaí are doing a phenomenal job. We've seen this with the operation to do with domestic abuse and domestic violence during COVID, and the same with the sexual violence. And the different units around the country, phenomenal work. But no matter what phenomenal work the Gardaí do to get really strong books of evidence into the DPP's office, because of the evidential threshold, and I'm not arguing against the evidential threshold, because of the powers that the state has as a result of, a successful conviction. But we need to get really be intelligent about accepting this problem in terms of justice. There's no point ignoring it. any longer and saying, report, report, and we'll get you justice. It doesn't happen that way always. For a lot of people.
Really interesting. I know we're running short on time now, but I do want to just pose a quick question to you about the biggest benefit and the biggest challenge you see for restorative justice for the various stakeholders, victims, offenders, criminal justice system, and so on. So I might start with you, Marie. If you were to pick out the biggest benefit and the biggest challenge.
Well, the biggest benefit for victims, I can speak to my research and to my clinical practice. They say I get an opportunity to ask the questions that only the offender can answer. I get an opportunity to make statements that I need him to hear, irrespective of him or her, of how they respond. I get an opportunity to do this. And then overriding all that is the sense of empowerment. It's like a rebalancing of power. And I know people are concerned about, the power dynamics in the room. That's why we need trained facilitators. But the research indicates, and my studies indicate, and my clinical practice and case studies indicate that the sense of empowerment for victims is really high following these restorative meetings. In relation to offenders, I think in relation to victims, the challenge is sometimes what Ursula said, that they don't know about it, or that they know and they have this idea that they want to meet them, and then the families are understandably saying you couldn't do that, forget about them, and so on. And so it's like they don't know where to go to get the service. And we need to help them know that this is a possibility if they would like it. So that's the challenge, I think, for victims. And interestingly, in the last few weeks, I've had 2 victims in Scotland looking for restorative justice. And what we have done is we found that restorative justice in Scotland after sexual crime is also a problem. The availability, we have combed the place. Everybody we know, every expert in the place. And so, that's just interesting. We're not unique here in terms of victims not knowing where to go. Like one contacted Alva and one contacted myself, and then we were both in contact with both of them. But so that's the challenge, knowing where to go and how to get the service. For offenders, I think the benefits are really this sense of being able to do something honourable. It's in their interest, they tell us, through research. It's in my interest to know that the victim is getting on with her life. When I sleep, put down my head at night, it's better for me if I think she's getting on okay or he's getting on okay. So what the biggest benefits are that they feel they can contribute. They are not the holder of the healing of the victim. We couldn't think that or give them the power, but that they can do something that might be useful for a victim. And I think that enhances their own self-esteem. And Ursula was talking about desistance. There isn't research in this, but I would be surprised if there wasn't an impact on desistance following engagement in restorative justice for offenders. There's some, but there isn't enough research. I think the challenges, what we found in our studies, well, first of all, some of them have orders that say prohibit them from making contact with victims. And so when we talk about, would you like to, often we'll have to go back to court to get the order changed so that they can engage in restorative justice. So that's a real challenge. And secondly, I think maybe shame or, again, not sure how this would be. And I know from my work with offenders, say at Granada, and indeed in the prison when I was in the probation service, they wanted to do something useful, but they didn't know how in relation to the victim. They wanted to issue an apology. And I remember in one case I was involved, multiple, but one in particular, we went to the defense counsel, senior counsel, and said he wants to make a statement on the stand of apology because he knows this will be the only time that he will get this opportunity. And defense counsel thought long and hard about it, but the man did take the stand. He was a clergyman, and he took the stand and apologized to the victim from the stand, having pleaded guilty, because it was the only way he could do that. And so we know that offenders, I know from my research, that they want to do something useful. So the challenge is not being sure how to go about it. What are the mechanisms?
Great, thank you. And Ursula, same question to you, the biggest benefit and the primary challenges.
Well, I think we've talked quite a lot about the challenges, so I'll just start maybe with the benefits and come back to the challenges as we're conscious of time, as you say, Deirdre. I think in terms of the benefits, and I'm drawing, Marie references her research, and that's why I made the point about the need to be doing, gathering our data, doing more research. But from our experience of working with victims where there has been a restorative justice intervention, I'm going to go back to two of the words I used at the beginning, which was around narrative and storytelling and writing the story of your life script, so to speak. And the second one is redemption, which Marie has touched upon there earlier on as well. And I think for the victim, it's not about obviously for redemption for the victim, it's really around the closure and the opportunity for healing. I sometimes worry about the word restore, because you cannot restore a situation. You can't, as somebody said, the bell can't be unrung. So that's happened. So it's really around how a victim is allowed to make sense to some extent of what's actually happened to them. Something that really any rational person would say is totally, there's no sense to it at all. But there are, and I'm always struck by if I could use the word angle, the question that victims come with, things that we mightn't have anticipated. And therefore the importance, as we spoke about earlier, of not going in with these preconceived notions about what's good for one or good for the other, but being able to hear what it is that the victim needs from that process. And I think the benefit for them is having the opportunity to have that voice, to tell their story, to talk about the impact, to ask questions, I think, and to actually just be able to face somebody and say, do you realize the impact that this has on my life? So I think that has been really important for people. And, we have experienced, and Marie, and with your experience with some of your cases, but we've certainly had that sense of, and this is with a small number of victims with sexual violence, of saying that it's like something has just been lifted from their shoulders when they've had what can sometimes be a very powerful and not necessarily, how can I put it, quite a very challenging engagement with the offender, where there is anger, which has been channeled in a particular way, but they're being allowed to express the intensity of their emotions. From the offender's perspective, I think it's really important that the story from the offender's perspective, to tell their story. And it's not about, it's about a truth that's there in the room between those two people. It's not about rehearsing the court case or who said what, or, and that's obviously, I want to go back to the word, I think it was Marie used preparation. I usually use it myself a lot. It's preparation, rehearsing, discussing, going back and forth, the checking and the counter checking that needs to be done if you're going to have what we would call a safe intervention. And of course, the unexpected can always happen. We have to be ready for that as well. And that's the hallmark of the facilitator, who can actually work with that, anticipate some of them maybe. So I think just in terms of the opportunity for the offender to tell their story, to actually have the chance and the opportunity to say, I do recognize that harm that's done, or maybe to be able to say, which I think must be very important for a victim, that they understand better, or it's not that it mightn't have been discussed with them previously or whatever, but there's something, the power of the words coming from the victim's voice. And it's about a shifting of relationships, because in a way there is a relationship between that victim and the offender, in terms of the horrible experience that has thrust them together and brought them together, maybe targeted by the offender. So it is that reassertion of control over one's life. And I think to free, our experience with offenders has been, it has freed them from something that maybe they were carrying around, facing up to the guilt and the shame. And the shame, that importance of that reintegrative shaming that Braithwaite talks about, that is so critical in the restorative justice process. So it does enable offenders to go forward. And so what we've experienced is offenders saying, I can't believe I didn't do this before. I can't believe I didn't know about this, or that I had the chance to do this. And I do think that increasingly, and when I go back to my early practice as a much younger probation officer, I think offenders were sometimes talking to me about restorative justice in some shape or form. And they were looking to find the words. This is going back quite some time. And I think we need to be more able to facilitate, you know, those conversations. And just to go to community quickly, Deirdre, the integration of the community in the problem solving, that they are at the table, that they're representative of the community, because whether one is a victim or an offender, all come from communities. And very often the same communities, or the smaller community of family or school or church that we talked about earlier.
Great, and it's lovely to highlight the benefits, I think, as we're coming towards the end of our conversation. I have one more question for both of you, and to Ursula first. How do you see restorative justice developing in Ireland into the future?
I thought Marie and I had scoped that out already, actually, in our conversation.
That's fair enough. Yeah. You may not, you may not want to add anything at this stage.
I'm jesting slightly, Deirdre. I think in terms of, there have been a lot of, I think, building blocks put in place, and they're there, and Marie has articulated them. I think there is a real opportunity at the moment, given some of the changes that have happened. And I do want to mention the Restorative Justice Strategies for Change project, which has come from the Council of Europe recommendation. And my own unit actually just was set up just at the same time as that was published. And I think that recommendation really is so very explicit and clear about the use of restorative justice, and the, I suppose, the urgency to actually, you know, take things forward. So in terms of in the coming years, I do see, and following on from the minister's statement, that opportunity to take some of those blocks and actually put them into a shape. I wouldn't like to say whether we have the platform, but I think we certainly have a lot of the blocks, and it does need that engagement, certainly across the different sectors in the Department of Justice, and drawing from the other government departments, as we spoke about earlier. And I would be, as I say, very optimistic in terms of what could be achieved there.
Great, thank you. And Marie, do you want to add anything? I know we have talked about it to an extent.
Yes, we have talked about it. I just say two things. One isn't on exactly this question, but it's something Ursula raised, and just to it's on the word restorative. We talked about justice in the beginning, and we're coming towards the end, and we talk about restorative for a second. Like you, Ursula, it was a problematic word for me, and we, you know, Estelle and myself and various others and myself, we've written a bit about this and whatever. What is restorative justice? But actually the answer came from victims. They told us, do you know what's restored? Power. So that's what's restored from a victim's perspective. So I'm much more comfortable now with the term restorative justice, because I've learned from victims that when they go through this, they feel it's not, life is just not restored to how it was, but that's not possible in any circumstance in life. But they say what's restored is power. But just on the institutionalization and the future and whatever, I think we've, as Ursula said, we've scoped it out here. This is, the committee has sat. And that's great. And please God, you know, we'll have all sorts of possibilities with Minister McEntee's statement on this and so on. But I think we also need to keep our eye on other jurisdictions with how restorative justice was institutionalized, and, if you like, the unintended consequences. And I'm thinking of Northern Ireland. So, for instance, you mentioned communities, Ursula. Like, there was lots and lots and lots of community restorative justice following the Troubles in Northern Ireland. You know, really, really good community work. I was involved in visiting some of the programs, and when I trained in University of Ulster and so on, and as external examiner, I hear a lot about them. And they sprung up everywhere. And obviously there had to be governance then in relation to funding and so on. But with the governance and the funding came kind of some constraints on practice and some disquiet amongst the community groups. So I think that the institutionalizing and the importance of governance of such a service in the country is very important. But I also think there can be unintended consequences of how that governance is designed, if you like. So I would say, whilst the committee has sat and we've solved all the problems, we also need to think about what we can learn from other jurisdictions, and there's lots to be learned.
Brilliant.
And I think, could I just say the all-island piece as well, because we didn't mention it in our discussions, you know, that obviously we're looking for structures here in the south, but there is a lot of learning from, as Marie said, internationally. But I'm just very mindful that, you know, there is an adult restorative justice strategy being scoped, so it's really important that, you know, we learn. And I totally agree, it's always such an important phrase, the unintended consequences. We definitely don't want to reproduce some of the areas that we have already identified as the deficits in traditional criminal justice, but to align restorative justice in a very positive and complementary and supportive way with traditional justice.
Absolutely, and I think that's a lovely note to end on, actually. So I wanted to thank you so much for a really insightful and informative discussion. I think our viewers will find it really interesting and fascinating, and indeed will give them lots of food for thought as well. So thank you so much for taking part in this conversation.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you.